The sound tore through the noon heat before David Turner even knew what it was. A chainsaw shrieked, metal teeth chewing into wood, and with every scream another limb of the oak came crashing down. Branches snapped, leaves spiraled, shards of bark flew like shrapnel. A red security camera light blinked above the garage, catching it all. That tiny red dot pulsed steadily, dispassionately, like a heart that refused to look away. The camera was no neighbor, no friend, no judge, but it would become a witness. David stumbled out of his studio, rag in hand, paint still drying under one fingernail. He was 45, a teacher who had drawn and painted that oak tree more times than he could count. In summer, his students sketched its canopy for shade. In winter, he had hung lanterns on its branches. Now, in one brutal afternoon, it was being stripped apart like paper. Greg Howard stood in the wreckage, chainsaw roaring against the trunk. 52 years old, chest puffed, ball cap turned backwards. He looked not like a neighbor but like a foreman staging a demolition. His boots pressed deep into David's mulch, kicking at the roots as if they were weeds trespassing across the soil. Greg shouted above the scream of the blade, "Your roots are on my land, so your tree is mine to take." The words punched through the hot air. The saw belched another cough of gasoline smoke, thick and bitter, clinging to the back of David's throat. David's voice broke when he answered, but his jaw locked. "That tree was planted before your house was even built. You can't just erase decades in an afternoon." He stopped at the yellow hazard tape Greg had tied across the fence, as if tape could turn theft into safety. Dust stung his eyes. The whole yard smelled of resin, sap bleeding under the heat. He could taste metal on his lips. Another crack. A limb the size of a body toppled, split against the stone path, and something skittered across the concrete. A small brass rectangle that clanged, spun, and came to rest face up. Turner. Residence, 1983. David saw it. The camera saw it. Even the workers saw it, eyes flicking toward the plate as if it had spoken. The brass plaque, once bolted to the treehouse his father built, now lay flat in the dust like a gravestone. It glinted in the sun, already a piece of evidence waiting for a judge to read. Greg laughed, voice sharp and mean. He leaned on the saw as if it were a scepter. "Decades, Turner? Decades just rot foundations. You want nostalgia. I want safety." Guess which one wins? One of his crew shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping to the property marker pin peeking from the soil. He opened his mouth, but Greg barked, "Back to it." The man shrank, silent. David didn't push the tape. He didn't lunge. His body trembled with adrenaline, but his eyes were steady. Took in everything. The mulch ground under Greg's boots, the surveyor's pin, the red blink of the camera. He catalogued the scene like a sketch line, angle, proof. Sawdust swirled around him like snow in a storm, scratching at his skin, coating his tongue. His chest hurt with memory. He saw, for a moment, his father's rough hands guiding a sapling into a hole decades earlier, telling a boy too young to listen. Some roots hold more than soil. They hold family. David blinked hard. The memory vanished, the noise returned. The chainsaw growled alive again. Greg lifted it to the trunk, grinning wide enough to show he wasn't afraid of neighbors watching from curtains. He had the noise, the boots, the men. He had the confidence of someone convinced that power excused trespass. "Don't worry, Turner," Greg sneered. "I'll send you the invoice." David's breath slowed. He stepped back into the full frame of the camera, so the lens captured him, the trunk, the plaque, and Greg's boot on his soil. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a witness positioning himself. His voice dropped, low, deliberate, each word cutting sharper than the saw. "Truth doesn't knock. It kicks the door in." "Berg," snorted, dismissive. "Cute lime." He yanked the starter cord again. The engine screamed, chips of oak flying like sparks. The brass plate trembled in the dust from the vibration, then slid a half-inch closer to the roots it once named. On the porch across the street, Mrs. Alvarez set down her groceries, eggs balancing on top, and pulled out her phone. She didn't know if she should call the city, the police, or just keep the camera rolling. Something here was wrong, and the tree wasn't the only thing being cut down. Inside the house, a curtain closed. A child's voice whispered, hushed by an anxious parent. Greg raised the saw shoulder high. He believed this was the finishing cut. He believed noise, swagger, and dust were louder than consent. Once. Twice. Always watching. The oak groaned, ancient wood straining against the inevitable. Sap bled bright down its side. The hazard tape snapped free from one post and fluttered in the air like a warning flag no one wanted to see. David's hand loosened around the rag. A drop of turpentine fell onto the dust, darkening it like an eye opening. His jaw set. His silence wasn't surrender. It was record. Greg's saw dug deeper. The trunk screamed back. And in that scream lived not only wood and roots, but the first crack of a case that would soon tear open in court. The courtroom was colder than it looked. Fluorescent lights hummed above the benches, humming so steadily it almost sounded like approval. The oak outside had been cut down weeks ago, but inside, its ghost still hung in the air, sap and gasoline and betrayal echoing every time the lawyers shuffled papers. Greg Howard sat at the witness stand as if it were a bar stool. He leaned one elbow on the edge, chin lifted, tie knotted too tight but worn like a badge of competence. He spoke with the same swagger he had used over the roar of the chainsaw, only now there was no saw, only silence, waiting to be filled. "I cut it," Greg began, letting the words settle like sawdust, "because the roots were invading my foundation, breaking pipes. I acted to protect my property. Any man would." His voice had a rhythm, the rhythm of construction foremen shouting orders across a site. Each sentence hit like a nail, hammered not with care but with speed. He had rehearsed this story. It wasn't truth, but it was scaffolding strong enough to stand for a while. The assistant prosecutor, a man with two clean shoes and a smirk that curled only one side of his mouth, nodded as if Greg had just quoted scripture. A couple of neighbors, summoned as character witnesses, muttered assent from the gallery. "That Turner's always been difficult," one whispered, "always guarding those trees like they're sacred relics." On the clerk's bench, a young man in a pressed shirt bit his lip. His pen hovered above the page, then scratched two words in the margin of his notes. "Line crossed?" Greg straightened his back, ready to pour more cement over the lie. "I've built houses. Managed crews. I know what safety requires. That tree was a hazard." The word snapped into the air like a whip. Hazard mitigation. The phrase carried a rehearsed authority, like a technical spell cast to numb the ear. The prosecutor smiled, the judge leaned fractionally forward, the neighbors nodded again. And somewhere, in a grainy corner of the courtroom where the red light of the security footage had been set up for later review, a blink caught David's eye. The light ticked once, like the camera itself disagreed. Greg said it again. "Hazard mitigation. Blink." He leaned forward, gesturing with thick fingers, tracing shapes of roots breaking into concrete. "I saw cracks forming near my garage slab. Pipes rattling when water ran. Anyone in construction knows what comes next. Collapse, mold, lawsuits. I didn't want danger on my hands. So I did what was necessary." Blink. Necessary. Landed in the air with the weight of inevitability, as though cutting down another man's oak was no different than trimming a hedge. David Turner sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes steady. He hadn't spoken yet. He hadn't needed to. His silence was both shield and blade, waiting. When Greg's words landed, "Hazard mitigation," David's gaze didn't flicker. Less the speaking with the camera light did. The blinking red was merciless, pulsing each time the lie repeated, as if synchronizing falsehood with truth's heartbeat. The assistant prosecutor cleared his throat. "Mr. Howard, did you at any point consult with Mr. Ask Turner before removing the tree?" Bred in feigned offense. "Consult? I tried. More than once. But you can't talk to Turner. He's stubborn, obsessive. That oak was his altar. He never saw reason. I had to act before damage became disaster." Eagered mitigation. Blink. The gallery stirred. A woman in the second row whispered to her husband, "Sounds right. Boots can ruin pipes." Another man, Greg's golfing buddy, nodded along. Each nod was another thread tightening the net around David. Greg spread his hands, palms up like a preacher. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I protected my home. I protected my family. Anyone in my shoes would have done the same." The prosecutor leaned back in satisfaction. His smirk deepened. From the clerk's desk, the young man scribbled again, "Choice," disguised as necessity. He underlined it twice, then glanced up at David, quiet, unmoving, but with eyes sharp enough to cut steel. Greg wasn't done. Lies rarely end where they begin. They metastasize. "I've spent 30 years in construction," Greg boasted. "You don't just build houses, you learn to read the land. Roots, foundations. That oak was a ticking time bomb. I saved not just myself, but Turner too. If the roots had snapped his water main, he'd be here suing me for negligence. I did him a favor." Hazard mitigation. Blink. A favor. The word oozed over the courtroom like oil. Some people nodded again. Others pursed their lips. The judge kept his face neutral, but even neutrality felt like siding with confidence over silence. Greg leaned closer to the mic. "Let's be honest. Turner's always been difficult. Complained about my crews parking on the curb. Complained about my tools making noise. He's the type to make trouble out of nothing. I wasn't going to wait around for him to drag me into another argument." The prosecutor interjected smoothly, "So in your professional judgment, Mr. 1. Howard, this was a necessary action." Greg smiled like the question was a gift. "Absolutely. A hazard neutralized. Hazard mitigation." Blink. The courtroom recorder tapped keys, her eyes dull, her fingers quick. To her, it was just another line of testimony. But to David, every blink of the camera was a counterweight. The camera remembered what human ears wanted to forget. Greg reclined slightly, as if the testimony were complete, but then he added one more nail to his construction of lies. "I sleep better now. My family sleeps better. No more worries about cracks spreading, pipes bursting, lawsuits looming. The neighborhood is safer because I acted." Hazard mitigation. Blink. The neighbors murmured again. The words "safer" and "family" were bait, and they swallowed it. But the clerk, his pen trembling, wrote something else this time. "Safety without consent is theft." He stared at it for a moment, then tucked the note under his folder, as if ashamed that he'd thought it. David inhaled slowly. He had catalogued every lie, every word weighed down with arrogance. His eyes flicked once to the camera's red light. It blinked, as if in solidarity. Greg's attorney stood, smoothing his tie. No further questions. The assistant prosecutor closed his notebook with a flourish, satisfied. He had his villain painted as a hero, his trespass masked as civic duty. "Yeah." The system nodded along. The chorus of approval hummed under the fluorescent lights. And still, David said nothing. Not yet. His silence was a lens, focused and merciless. The judge turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Turner, you'll have your opportunity." David's fingers brushed against the edge of the brass plaque tucked inside his folder. The same plaque that had fallen from the oak like a prophecy. Turner. Residence 1983. It was more than metal. It was time itself. Engraved and undeniable. He kept his hand steady. He didn't lift it. Not yet. Greg smirked, certain he had won. His lies had found purchase. The prosecutor had nodded. The neighbors had nodded. Even the judge had given him space. But the camera light blinked again, as if to remind everyone. Truth was patient. Truth recorded. Truth waited. David's eyes stayed on Greg, unblinking. For now, he allowed the lie to build higher. Brick on brick, beam on beam. A tower swaying under its own arrogance. He would let it rise until it blocked out the light, because only then would the fall matter. Blank hazard mitigation. Blink. The courtroom sighed with the weight of Greg's story. The gallery shifted, believing. The system tilted, complicit. And in that silence, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights, the lie crowned itself king. But kings fall. Always. The last echo of Greg's voice still hung in the rafters when the judge turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Turner," the judge said, tone clipped but not unkind, "this is your opportunity to respond." For the first time since the hearing began, David rose. His chair scraped softly against the tile, a sound so small it cut louder than Greg's boasting had moments earlier. He stood with both palms flat on the table for a beat, drawing the air into his lungs. The gallery rustled, neighbors leaning forward, the prosecutor smirking, Greg crossing his arms as if he'd already won. The silence stretched. Then David spoke. "With respect, Your Honor," he began, voice steady even. "Washington State Law, Section 64. 12 IO 30 is clear. A person who cuts down, girdles, or otherwise injures a tree on another's land without permission is liable for treble damages." The words landed like a gavel strike. No theatrics. No raised pitch. Just statute. Exact and undeniable. The clerk's pen scratched furiously. The prosecutor's smirk faltered. Greg blinked, color rising in his cheeks. David lifted a slim folder. He opened it with deliberate care and held up a photograph. The oak standing tall, its trunk broad, canopy stretching into the sky. The date stamp in the corner read April 2023. He laid it on the evidence screen, where the court's projector cast it across the wall like a mural. The tree loomed larger than life, alive again. "Exhibit A," David said, measured. He placed a second sheet beside it, the deed to his property, registered 1983, bearing the Turner name. Then another, a survey map from 1985, boundary lines traced in black, the oak's position circled in red ink. "This tree stood wholly within my property line," David continued, voice never rising. "For 40 years it grew there, nourished by soil that belonged to my family. Its branches did not rewrite that deed. Its roots did not cross that survey. Ownership remained as clear as the ink on these documents." The gallery stirred louder now. Someone whispered, "He has maps?" Another hissed back, "That's the law itself." He shifted in the witness chair, jaw tightening, a bead of sweat trailing past his temple. David let the moment breathe. Then he spoke again, sharper now, carving silence with syllables. "It is about consent, about respect. Roots do not erase ownership." The words rang against the wood panels, bouncing back with the weight of principle. The judge tilted his head slightly, as if considering them. The clerk underlined the sentence twice. David placed one final page on the stand, a letter from the city arborist filed in 2020, praising the oak as a healthy, structurally sound specimen with no evidence of hazard to surrounding property. The date alone sliced Greg's testimony apart. "Your Honor," David said, voice firm, "the only hazard was arrogance." A murmur swept the benches. Someone stifled a gasp. Greg's fists curled in his lap. David paused, his eyes dropping for a fraction of a second to the brass plaque tucked safely inside his folder. For just that heartbeat, his mind wandered backward. He saw himself at 13, knees in the dirt, sweat trickling down his temple. His father knelt beside him, palms calloused, pressing soil over the fragile sapling that looked too thin to survive a storm. His father's voice had been gentle but firm. "Some roots hold more than soil, David. They hold family." Back in the courtroom, David blinked once, memory dissolving. His gaze rose steady again. "This tree," he said, gesturing toward the projected photograph, "was not just timber. It was 40 years of stewardship. It was the shade my students sketched, the anchor for a treehouse where children laughed, the monument my father planted before this subdivision even had streetlights. Destroying it was not hazard mitigation. It was theft." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Greg muttered, "Objection argumentative." The judge lifted a hand. "Overruled. Continue." David inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned toward Greg, but did not address him directly. He looked past him, through him, toward the record itself. "In my profession as a teacher," David said, "I tell my students that lines matter. In art, a single line can define a boundary, create form, establish truth. In law, lines matter even more. A boundary line on a survey is not a suggestion, it is a covenant. It says, "Here ends yours. Here begins mine." To cross it without consent is not correction, it is violation. The gallery was hushed now. Even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed to fade, replaced by the sharpness of David's tone. "Mr. Howard," David continued, still not looking at Greg, "has painted himself a savior. He claims to have acted for safety, for the neighborhood. But safety without consent is tyranny, and trespass dressed as duty is still trespass." Greg's face was crimson. His knuckles whitened against the wood of the witness box. David lifted the survey map once more, letting the black lines gleam under the overhead lights. "Boundaries exist for a reason," he said. "Respect them, and neighbors thrive. Cross them, and conflict blooms. This court does not exist to reward arrogance. It exists to restore what arrogance destroys." The judge leaned back slowly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The clerk stopped writing for a second, staring at David as if memorizing every word. Greg slammed a palm against the box. "This is ridiculous. But I protected my property. That tree." "Sit down, Mr. Howard," the judge snapped. Silence fell again. David breathed evenly, never breaking cadence. "Your Honor, I am not here to inflame, nor to exaggerate. I am here to apply the law. RCW 64-03 there demands treble damages for unauthorized removal. The oak's appraised value stands at $30,000. By statute, the penalty is $90,000. The number settled in the air like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. The gallery whispered. Greg's jaw dropped, then snapped shut, teeth grinding audibly. David closed the folder softly. "This is not about revenge," he said. "It is about respect for law. It is about proving that roots may run deep, but they do not grant license to erase what is not yours." He sat down. The chair's quiet scrape against the tile sounded again, echoing across the courtroom, sharper than any gavel. The gallery buzzed in shock. The assistant prosecutor leafed furiously through his notes, and Greg muttered curses under his breath. But David, hands folded now, eyes calm, simply waited. His words had been enough. The law had spoken through him, not in thunder but in steel. And somewhere, in the corner of the room, the red light blinked again. It had recorded Greg's swagger, his lies, his boast of hazard mitigation. Now, it had recorded David's calm recitation of law, his father's lesson wrapped into statute, his refusal to be erased. Plans had shifted. The chainsaw's roar was gone. Only the voice of reason remained. The courtroom buzz had barely quieted after David's recitation of statute when the judge leaned forward. His glasses caught the fluorescent glare as he spoke. "Mr. Turner, do you have anything further?" David rose once more. This time, he did not open his folder of photographs or maps. He reached inside the inner pocket of his jacket, fingers brushing against the edge of something he had carried but not touched in years. The gallery leaned forward, expecting another deed, another survey, another photograph. Instead, David drew out a slim leather case. He paused, thumb on its edge, feeling the weight that was not measured in ounces but in years. With slow, deliberate care, he flipped it open. A rectangle of laminated plastic caught the overhead light. The Washington State Bar Association seal glimmered faintly, the embossed lettering alive under the glare. His name, David J. Turner, was printed in steady black font. Gasps broke across the benches like ripples in a pond. The young clerk's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Even the court reporter looked up from her keys, her fingers frozen mid-syllable. Greg's jaw sagged, then clenched. His hands, so confident gripping the chainsaw in the yard weeks before, now gripped the witness stand as if he were falling. The assistant prosecutor blinked hard and looked away, pretending to shuffle papers, but his ears burned red. The smirk that had carried him through Greg's testimony had evaporated. David let the silence stretch. He turned the card slowly, letting the seal gleam. It was not just a card. It was a mirror held up to every person in the room who had mistaken him for a simple schoolteacher playing amateur lawyer. He slipped the card onto the evidence projector, and the image enlarged on the courtroom screen. The bar seal, magnified and undeniable, filled the wall. A murmur swept through the gallery. "He's an attorney," someone whispered. "He's still licensed." David's voice, calm and measured, cut through the astonishment. "Yes, Your Honor. I am an art teacher. But I am also an attorney, admitted to practice law in this state, license active and in good standing." He let his words breathe, then added quietly, "I walked away from litigation years ago. I thought teaching was my path, a quieter path. I thought silence was safer." His eyes flicked to the brass plaque tucked in his folder, the plaque that had fallen from the oak like a relic. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Some roots hold more than soil. They hold family." David drew in a breath. "I've stayed silent long enough," he thought. "Today, I return to the table of justice." Slow motion seemed to overtake the room. He adjusted the lapels of his jacket, a simple gray blazer suddenly heavy, as if stitched with every case he had once fought. The fabric caught the light, throwing a muted sheen across the floor. It wasn't a robe, but in that moment it carried the gravity of one. He looked up at the judge. "I did not enter this courtroom merely as a property owner. I entered as a man bound by oath. An oath I once swore to uphold the law, to protect the vulnerable, to defend the truth. I may have stepped away from the courtroom, but that oath never expired." Greg shifted violently in his seat. This is a stunt," he spat, voice cracking. "He's playing games." The judge raised a hand. "Quiet, Mr. Howard." David turned toward the gallery, not addressing anyone directly, but letting his gaze sweep across the benches, across the clerk whose pen still lay on the floor. "For weeks," David said, "I allowed myself to be painted as eccentric, stubborn, sentimental. I let lies stand unchecked, believing the truth alone would eventually shine. That was my mistake. Silence does not protect. Silence only feeds arrogance." He let the words sink. Every person in the room, from the prosecutor to the last neighbor in the back row, knew they had seen him as powerless. Now they realized they had misread him entirely. David placed his palm flat on the bar card projected on the wall. "This is not about a career. This is about a promise. And that promise is older than Greg Howard's house, older even than the foundation he claims to protect. It is the promise that lines matter, that boundaries matter, that respect is not optional." The judge leaned back, expression unreadable but intent. The clerk bent to retrieve his pen, but his hand trembled as he wrote again. "Silence is not neutral. It is surrender." Greg's eyes darted around the room, desperate for a nod of support. None came. Even his golfing buddy in the gallery avoided eye contact. The bravado that had fueled his testimony bled out of him, leaving only sweat and clenched teeth. David adjusted his blazer once more, as if settling into a seat he had left too long. His voice softened, but carried further for its calm. "I will not stay silent anymore," he said. "Not as a teacher, not as an attorney, and not as a son of the man who planted that oak." That tree stood as proof that roots can hold both soil and family. To cut it without consent was not just vandalism. It was a violation of law, of respect, of trust. He lifted his eyes to meet the judge's. "And now the law will answer." The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath. The red camera light blinked once more, steady as ever, indifferent to drama, but immortalizing the moment. The instant a quiet man revealed he was not only a victim, but also a sworn guardian of the law. Greg sagged back, pale under the harsh lights. The prosecutor shuffled papers without purpose, caught in the realization that the ground had shifted under his case. The gallery buzzed with whispers, awe, and the first hint of fear for the man who had wielded a chainsaw like a crown. David gathered his folder, his father's plaque resting inside, and sat down. His silence this time was not retreat. It was reign. The balance of the courtroom had reversed. The man once accused of stubborn sentimentality was now recognized as something else entirely. a lawyer, a son, a witness, and, most dangerously for Greg Howard, a voice no longer willing to be quiet. The courtroom had already shifted once when David revealed his bar card. But now, it was about to tip entirely. David rose again, this time carrying a small black remote in his right hand. He pressed the button once, and the projector screen flickered to life. Click. The first image appeared, an overhead satellite shot from Google Maps, bright and unforgiving, boundary lines overlaid in red. A small pin gleamed at the corner where David's property ended. The oak shadow, wide and unmistakable, stretched entirely within his side of the fence. The gallery leaned forward as if gravity had pulled them. David pointed with a calm hand. "Here is the survey overlay, Your Honor. You can see the property marker here." He tapped the screen, the red pin pulsing on the map. "And here. The oak. The trunk sits completely within my parcel. There is no encroachment. Not 1 inch." Greg swallowed, the muscles in his jaw twitching. The judge leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. "Counsel, this map has a date stamp of April 2023? "Yes, Your Honor," David replied, "taken just months before the incident. Technology does not forget, even when arrogance hopes it will." Click. The image changed to a series of photographs. The oak's base, the brass plaque still visible before the cut, the roots weaving into David's garden bed. "This is Exhibit C," David continued, voice even. "Photographs taken weeks before Mr. Ray, Howard acted. The roots lift soil here, yes, but never cross the legal line. Growth is not trespass. A shadow is not invasion." The clerk's pen scratched furiously, underlining the phrase, "Growth is not trespass." Greg shifted again, wiping his palm against his slacks. Click. A scanned city document filled the screen. An official arborist report, seal-stamped, date visible. "This is Exhibit D," David said. "A city arborist's evaluation from 2020. It certifies the oak as structurally sound, healthy, and without evidence of hazard to surrounding property. No recommendation for removal, no evidence of danger, no safety report filed." He let the silence breathe. Then, Mr. Howard told this court he acted to mitigate hazard. Yet the city itself declared none existed. The gallery stirred, louder now. Someone whispered, "That's official," and another muttered, "Then why'd he cut it?" Greg's knuckles whitened on the wooden edge of the witness box. Click. The screen lit with something new, a screenshot of Greg's Facebook page. The post was dated the day of the felling. A photo of his backyard view stretched wide, free of the oak's canopy. His caption, smug and casual, read, "Finally got rid of that old oak. My view is clean now." The gallery gasped. Some even laughed. A sharp, scandalized laugh. Phones buzzed as people scribbled notes and screens lit with quick searches. Greg's face turned scarlet. He stammered, That was a joke." David's voice cut, firm but measured. "Knobberus. Safety was never the issue. Convenience was." The words landed like a gavel. The judge's expression hardened. The assistant prosecutor closed his notebook a little too fast, as if hiding behind its cover. Greg's hands shook. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, his lips working silently. David pressed the remote again. Click. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and a short video filled the screen, grainy but clear enough. The security camera from David's garage, the little red light blinking in the corner. The saw, the dust, Greg's voice booming, "Your roots are on my land, so your tree is mine to take." The room went electric. Every juror leaned forward. The clerk froze mid-word. The court reporter even stopped typing for a second. On the screen, David's own voice rose over the saw. "That tree was planted before your house was even built. You can't just erase decades in an afternoon." The video cut. The silence afterward was deafening. He lowered the remote. He looked at Greg, who sat hunched, sweat plastering his hairline. "This court has heard his words today," David said, "and now you've heard his words that day. The difference between testimony and truth is as clear as this screen." The judge rubbed his temple, visibly unsettled. Yet David wasn't done. He took a step closer, folder in hand, voice still calm but tightening like a vice. I want to show one more thing. Click. The screen now displayed a chart. Bold numbers, stark and simple. Over the past 5 years, David said, his voice low but carrying, this county recorded 207 disputes involving unauthorized tree cutting. 63% of plaintiffs abandoned claims because they could not afford litigation. The economic loss to property owners totaled $2 million. He paused, letting the numbers linger, heavy as lead. Then his voice sharpened, cutting through the still air. These numbers aren't digits. They are human lives uprooted. Each one represents a neighbor who lost shade, a family who lost history, a child who lost the tree they grew under. Each one is a root cut without consent, a violation excused as convenience. The words rippled outward. The gallery stirred with low murmurs. The young clerk scribbled fiercely, "Numbers as lives." Greg shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This is crazy. This is overblown." David turned sharply, finally letting his gaze pin Greg like a nail. "Overblown? You bragged about your view. You wielded a saw without permission. You erased a family's legacy for convenience. You lied in this courtroom about hazard, when safety was never threatened. King, that is not overblown. That is contempt." Greg's lips parted but no sound came. His hands trembled visibly. David faced the judge again, tone even. "The evidence is not complicated. Life. The map shows the line. The photographs show the roots. The arborist shows there was no hazard. The defendant's own words, spoken and written, show motive. The camera shows the act." He let his hand drop, the remote hanging at his side like a gavel after its strike. "Safety was never the issue," David repeated softly. "Convenience was." The gallery erupted, whispers crashing into one another. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but even the sharp cracks could not fully drown the murmur. Greg sat frozen, face pale now, sweat dripping, his earlier bravado stripped bare. His attorney leaned away as though distance could wash off the stain of association. David closed his folder, calm. His voice, quiet but clear, sealed the moment. Truth doesn't knock, it kicks the door in. And today, it entered with evidence. The red light of the projector blinked once before fading, like the camera itself nodding. The evidence had spoken, and the lies had crumbled. The courtroom was still reeling from the Facebook post, the security footage, the city arborist report. Greg sat hollow-eyed, his bravado stripped, sweat beading down his temple. But David wasn't finished. The law had spoken for one tree. Now, he would make it speak for every tree, every neighbor, every family silenced by convenience. He stepped closer to the projector, remote in hand. As the gallery leaned forward, the red light blinked again, ready to record. David's voice was calm, but his tone carried new gravity. "This is not one tree." He pressed the button. Click. The screen shifted to bold white letters on a black background. No photos, no maps, no scenery, just stark numbers hanging in the air like verdicts. 207 disputes. 63% dismissed. Flagrant 2 million lost. Plitator gasped. Even the judge leaned closer. The clerk scribbled quickly, circling each number, underlining twice. David's voice cut clean. Across this county, over 200 disputes in the last 5 years involved neighbors cutting trees without consent. More than half ended in silence, cases dismissed because victims could not afford representation. The economic loss? $4.2 million. $4.2 million stolen from communities in shade, in property value, in trust. He let the silence hold. The numbers glared down from the wall, impossible to soften, impossible to excuse. "This," David said, his voice rising slightly now, "is not about me. This is about us, about how roots are ripped without consequence, about how arrogance thrives where silence is forced." With the gallery stirred louder, a woman in the third row covered her mouth, tears streaming. She stood abruptly, voice trembling. They cut down my apple tree. Said the roots were spreading. It was my husband's tree. He planted it for our wedding. They never asked. They never paid. The judge raised a hand, but gently this time. Please, ma'am, remain seated. His tone was sympathetic, not stern. David turned toward her, nodding slowly. Thank you, he said, voice soft. You are not alone. He pressed the remote again. Another screen, a photograph of a backyard stripped bare, grass yellowing where shade used to stretch. A small swing sat empty, its ropes frayed. This was submitted with the county's survey reports, David explained. A boy of 9 lost his only tree, cut down by a neighbor who wanted sunlight for a new garden. He wrote in his school essay, quote, I don't like summer anymore. There's no shade. The sun burns my head. Gasps rippled across the benches. The clerk's pen stilled mid-stroke. Even the bailiff shifted, jaw tightening. David turned back to the judge. This courtroom is not just about my oak. It is about a system where silence is cheaper than justice, where those without counsel surrender, not because they are wrong, but because they cannot afford to be right. Greg muttered hoarsely. This isn't fair. David's head snapped toward him, eyes sharp. Fair? His voice cut like glass. Fair is consent. Fair is boundaries respected. Fair is roots that live because they are not yours to cut. What you did is not fairness. It is theft masked as convenience. Greg slumped back, unable to meet his gaze. David's voice softened again, shifting from confrontation to appeal. Your Honor, neighbors, community members, understand this. I am not asking for protection of one tree. I am asking for recognition that silence has been the default verdict for too long. That dismissal is not justice. That when half of all victims cannot fight back, the system is not impartial. It is broken. He lifted the remote once more. Click. The infographic returned, stark numbers glowing again. 207 disputes. 63% dismissed. Out of 4.2 million lost. David pointed, finger steady. These numbers do not describe accidents. Like describe design. A design where arrogance parades as necessity, where trespass cloaks itself as safety. This is not a glitch. It is a pattern. The judge tapped his pen against his notes, eyes thoughtful. David's voice deepened. Form and patterns matter, because one day it is my oak. Another day, it is her apple tree. The next, it is a boy's swing in the sun. Each cut leaves not just a stump, but a scar. A scar in trust, a scar in community, a scar in law. The woman with the apple tree wept openly now, clutching a tissue. The boy's swing photo lingered on the wall, heavy as memory. David lowered his voice, but its quiet drew everyone closer. This case is about whether we allow silence to remain the system's shield. Whether we let arrogance rewrite boundaries with saws and excuses, or whether we draw the line not in soil but in law, and say, enough. He turned slightly, looking across the gallery. Because I promise you, this is not the last tree. Unless we act, it will never be the last. The room sat in silence, only the hum of the projector filling the air. Even Greg, pale and sweating, had no words. David looked once more at the numbers, then back at the judge. His final line, low and sharp, sliced the stillness. 4.2 million is not money. It is history. It is shade. It is family. And today, this courtroom has the chance to say it matters. He clicked the remote again. Click. The screen went black. The silence afterward was not emptiness. It was weight. The kind of silence that bends people forward, makes them believe they've just heard something larger than a case. The red camera light blinked once more. Steady, unblinking, immortalizing not just a neighbor's grievance, but the moment a single oak became every tree, every root, every voice denied until now. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The evidence hung heavy in the air. Maps, photographs, city records, Greg's own Facebook post, the video with his voice roaring over the saw. The numbers still lingered in memory. 207 disputes, 4.2 million in losses. The mother's tears, the boy's empty swing. All of it pressed down on the room like a weight no gavel could lift. The judge leaned forward, fingers tented, eyes sweeping from Greg to David, then across the gallery that had swelled with restless murmurs. He raised the gavel, tapped it once, not to quiet, but to center. "This court," the judge began, his voice resonant and calm, "has reviewed the evidence presented. It has considered testimony, documents, video, and the law." Greg shifted violently in his chair, whispering hoarsely to his attorney. His face was slick with sweat, lips pale, jaw tight. The judge's eyes cut to him. "Mr. Howard, you entered this courtroom claiming hazard, necessity, mitigation. The evidence shows otherwise. Your own words, recorded and published, betray your motive. Convenience, not safety. Arrogance, not necessity. Violation, not duty." The gallery hummed louder. The judge struck the gavel once. Silence returned. "Washington State Law, Section 64, 12030, is not ambiguous," the judge continued. "A person who unlawfully cuts down or injures another's tree is liable for treble damages. The oak in question was valued at $30,000. Therefore, judgment is entered in favor of Mr. Invaver. Turner, damages trebled to $90,000. The gavel struck down hard. The sound cracked through the room like lightning splitting a trunk. Greg sagged backward, eyes wide, muttering curses too low for the recorder to catch. His attorney lowered his gaze, shoulders collapsing inward, as if hoping invisibility could erase defeat. The gallery erupted in a collective gasp, then a wave of whispers, shock, approval, even applause before the bailiff barked order. David stood slowly. He didn't need to. The verdict was already his. But he rose because justice demanded voice, not just silence. He faced the gallery, the judge, the blinking red light that had captured everything. His words came measured, quiet at first, but gathering strength with each breath. "I once stayed silent when others lost their roots," David said. His voice carried the weight of regret, not performance. "I regret that. I regret believing silence could shield anyone. I regret thinking truth could stand without a voice to carry it." He paused. The gallery leaned closer. But not today. Today, silence was broken. The words settled into the benches, into the court reporter's keys, into the trembling hand of the clerk. David's eyes swept the room. "Roots are not just wood," he began. His cadence shifted, rhythmic now, each phrase a drumbeat. "Roots are history. Roots are family. Roots are law." The gallery murmured at each repetition, the rhythm sinking deeper, a truth carved into collective memory. He took a step forward, voice stronger. "For 40 years my oak stood as history planted by my father, growing with me, sheltering generations of students. It was family. Its branches shaded laughter. Its trunk bore a plaque of our name. Its roots held our soil as our soil held it. And now it is law. Because today, this court has declared that roots matter. That silence is not consent. That arrogance has consequence." Greg slumped further, his bravado now, nothing but hollow skin. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smirk replaced with pale stillness. The clerk scribbled furiously, "Roots are history. Roots are family. Roots are law." David lowered his voice, softer now, almost a whisper that cut sharper than any shout. "Justice is not the axe that cuts, but the hand that guards what still stands." The proverb landed heavy, resonant. It felt carved into the air, etched like an inscription above a courthouse door. People in the gallery repeated it under their breath, testing its weight. Even the judge nodded once, lips tightening as though committing it to memory. David let the silence linger after his words. We didn't need more. The proverb had done its work. The gavel struck again, 3 times, final and absolute. "This matter is settled," the judge said. But the courtroom was no longer the same. It was charged, transformed, consecrated by something larger than law, by a voice that had refused to stay quiet, by roots that had proven stronger than saws, by silence that had finally been broken. As people filed out, the murmurs followed. The mother whispering to her husband about planting a new apple tree. The clerk whispering the proverb to himself. The boy in the back row tugging his father's sleeve and asking if they could plant again. David gathered his folder. He touched the brass plaque inside. Turner. Residence. 1983 feeling its weight, its promise. His father's words echoed once more. Some roots hold more than soil. They hold family. Today, they had also held justice. The red light blinked once more, capturing the moment as if to seal it forever. When the gavel fell for the last time, the sound rippled out of the courtroom and into the town. Some verdicts stay in files, buried in archives. This one spread like roots beneath pavement, quiet, unseen, but unstoppable. Greg Howard's fall was swift. Within a week, his construction company began losing contracts. Homeowners who once bragged about hiring the man with experience now whispered his name with caution. Local suppliers quietly cut ties. A neighborhood association released a statement condemning his actions, calling them a betrayal of trust. By the month's end, his office windows were dark, dust gathering on the reception desk. Newspapers ran the story front page. "The man who put price on roots," one headline read, above a photo of David leaving the courthouse, folder in hand, sunlight catching the brass plaque inside. Commentators debated the ruling on radio shows and podcasts. Some praised the treble damages as justice finally grown teeth. Others called it a warning shot to anyone who thought boundaries were suggestions. For David, life did not return to normal. It transformed. One morning, just a week after the verdict, David was cleaning brushes in his art room when a knock came. He opened the door to find one of his students, a boy barely 12, holding a small clay pot. Inside, a sapling leaned, fragile but eager. The boy grinned shyly. "So we plant again, right, Mr. E. Turner?" David's throat tightened. He bent down, resting a hand gently on the rim of the pot. "Yes," he said softly, "we plant again." That afternoon, they pressed the little sapling into the soil where the oak's shadow once stretched. Children from the neighborhood gathered, scooping dirt with plastic shovels, patting the earth around the roots. Parents stood back, some filming on their phones, others simply watching in silence. The red camera light was no longer needed. Dozens of eyes recorded the moment. A week later, David received a letter in a neat envelope, no return address. Inside was a page written in hurried script. "Mr. Turner," it began, "I was the clerk in your courtroom. I wrote notes while you spoke, but some words etched deeper than ink. Roots are law. Silence is surrender. I want you to know you changed me. I've applied to law school, not to chase prestige, but to study environmental law. You made me choose law with roots." The letter was unsigned, but the sincerity bled through every stroke. David folded it carefully and placed it beside the plaque from 1983. The community found ways to honor the verdict too. Parents formed a Roots committee to draft neighborhood agreements about trees, ensuring disputes would never again end in silence. The city council announced a new grant program, legal aid for property owners facing unauthorized tree removal. For once, the statistics David had shown on the screen were not just reminders of loss. They were seeds for reform. But perhaps the most powerful symbol came months later. The courthouse itself commissioned a new plaque for its entry hall. Bronze letters gleamed above the main doors. "The Hall of Living Roots." Below it, an inscription: "Justice is not the axe that cuts, but the hand that guards what still stands." Chi. Visitors paused to read it, running their fingers across the cool metal, whispering it aloud. School groups on field trips stopped there first, teachers explaining the story of the oak and the ruling that gave it voice. Even lawyers who had practiced for decades admitted they felt the words press against their chests as they walked inside. For David, every trip past those doors carried weight. He did not seek recognition, but he understood it. His father's lesson? Some roots hold more than soil. They hold family. was now etched into public memory, translated into law, and carried by others. Greg, meanwhile, vanished from public life. His house went on the market, the yard bare of shade. No one bid high. Buyers whispered about karma, about arrogance punished, about how even strong walls crumble when roots of arrogance run too deep. Yet the story did not end with Greg's silence. It continued in the boy's sapling, growing straighter with each rain. It continued in the clerk's application letter, in the mother who replanted her apple tree, in the father who built a new swing in his yard. It continued in every neighbor who realized boundaries were more than lines. They were promises. David often walked past the sapling in his yard, pausing to press a palm against its thin trunk. He never forgot the oak, never tried to replace it. But he understood something new. Justice was not only about restoring what was lost, but about protecting what still stood. The community knew it too. Whenever a dispute arose, a hedge trimmed too far, a branch cut without asking, people remembered the oak, they remembered the verdict, and they remembered the words etched in bronze at the courthouse doors. The man who put price on roots was no longer just a headline. It was a reminder that silence can be broken, that respect can be enforced, that even the quietest teacher can carry the weight of law when truth demands it. And so the story of one oak spread outward, growing into every conversation, every boundary line, every handshake across a fence. Its roots lived on, not in soil, but in memory, in reform, in justice. David Turner stepped out of the courthouse into a storm of flashing bulbs. Reporters pressed forward, microphones outstretched, voices overlapping. "Mr. Turner, how do you feel?" "Poured you. What do you say to the community? Do you think this verdict will change the law statewide?" He raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady the moment. The crowd quieted in waves. The courthouse doors loomed behind him, the new bronze plaque already drawing the attention of cameras. The Hall of Living Roots. David's voice was firm, low at first, but it carried. "Silence only feeds injustice," he said. "Lies kill faster than fists. Share this story, so no root, no family, is ever erased without a voice again." The flashes crackled brighter. Reporters scribbled furiously. A woman in the crowd whispered the words aloud, repeating them as if tasting their weight. David scanned the crowd. Then his eyes locked not on the press, but on the cameras themselves, the red lights blinking like the one that had caught Greg's chainsaw weeks before. For a heartbeat, it felt as though he wasn't speaking to the reporters at all. He was speaking to the people beyond the lens. "If you're watching this," he said, his tone piercing, "maybe you lost something cut down without asking. Maybe a neighbor took more than branches. Maybe they took trust, history, family. Hear me, your roots matter. Share this story." A ripple passed through the crowd. Some lifted their phones higher, streaming live. Others wiped their eyes, surprised by the sudden sting. David's voice grew stronger, each phrase a command, a mantra. "Plant again, speak again, fight again. Do not let silence be your soil. Do not let arrogance be your axe. Justice can grow, but only if we guard what stands and replant what is taken." Behind him, the plaque on the courthouse gleamed in the sun. Justice is not the axe that cuts, but the hand that guards what still stands. The proverb already belonged to the people. He could feel it taking root in their mouths, ready to be carried into classrooms, council meetings, backyards. He paused, letting the weight of it hang. Then his final words struck, sharp and unforgettable. "Captivate was heaven known, have consequences." And today, consequence grew back into justice. The flashes exploded. The words were already racing across social media, clipped into headlines, echoed in captions. David lowered his hand, nodded once, and stepped away. Not into silence, but into the murmur of a crowd that had found its voice.